The world of geopolitics is complex. It encapsulates foreign policy, defense, trade, and culture. These can have ripples that can be felt all around the planet.
With that, we welcome you to The Global Detail, a podcast where we go beyond borders and behind the headlines to stories that impact the world.
Our goal is to peel the onion and explore the various diverse layers through riveting interviews with experts and stalwarts. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas.
And co-piloting this journey, I'm Brendan Duke. Let's get into it. The Lucky Country was a hard-hitting novel published in 1964, written by the late Australian author Donald Horne. Considered ahead of its time, it was a scathing assessment of modern Australia, her politics, her institutions, business, arts, and her people. Horne didn't mince words when he said Australia was an unimaginative nation, mired in mediocrity. A country simply content on reaping the benefits of its geographic isolation and commodity-rich economic resources. It has been said the tyranny of distance is what has shaped Australian thought, culture, politics, and foreign policy, a Western nation geographically more east than the Far East. However, a new Australia has emerged in the last few decades, one that is aggressively participating on the global stage. The Australia that was once restrictive on immigration under the White Australia policy is now a multicultural nation and firmly a part of the Indo-Pacific. It is also a part of such minilaterals as the Quad. Ian Kemish is a veteran Australian diplomat who has served for 25 years with lead envoy roles to Papua New Guinea, Germany, and Switzerland. The Global Detail spoke to Ambassador Kemish to decipher the evolution of Australian diplomacy.
I think at the outset, I just want to say congrats on the book, The Consul. I can't really get my hand on the copy, so I've only lived through it vicariously through your interviews and your articles about it. But just it starts about your time, for your quarter of a century time with Australian Foreign Service, and you obviously know your former envoy to Papua New Guinea, to Germany, and worked with Prime Minister closely. Just lay the land on what the Consul is about. Why now? Why this book? And what do you hope to get out of it?
Look, it's great to be with you, and thanks a lot for the interest. I'm sorry I haven't got a hold of a copy of the book. Easiest if you're outside Australia to get hold of it on the online version, which is pretty easily ordered through any of the normal services. But what's the book Consul about? You're right. I did all the things that you just described in a diplomatic career for Australia that lasted for about 25 years. And, all the things that I thought about as a young graduate student with aspirations came to be honest. As I joined the Australian Foreign Service as a 20-something-year-old, I had ideas about, working in a career that involved crossing cultures, walking the corridors of power, advising prime ministers, being an ambassador, all that stuff. And I got to do all that, and yet I chose not to write about all that, but to write about a particular line of work that's conducted by the Australian service. But what I'm about to say is true of most like-minded governments. The US State Department, the British Service, the Indian Foreign Service, each have, like Australia, a service within a service, which we call the Consular Service. And the Consular Service, as defined by most countries, is essentially the work of stepping forward when one's fellow nationals encounter very serious trouble overseas, outside our borders. So, what are we talking about here? At one very soft, benign end of the spectrum, we're talking about, the literally hundreds in the Australian case of people who lose their passports, find themselves in some kind of difficulty like that. They're robbed. They encounter some kind of small welfare difficulty when they're overseas. At the other end of the spectrum, of course, people die when they're travelling, and sometimes the numbers shock people. Now, this book is about the Australian service, but you'd be surprised how much of this will translate across nations. So Australia's a country of about 24 million people. We're big travellers. In 2019, the last year before the pandemic really impacted international travel for Australians, Australians conducted about 12 million trips outside our borders. And given that we're an island continent, that's a pretty significant proportion of our population. What does that mean for the consular service on a daily basis? Well, it means that in that same year, 5 Australians died every 24-hour cycle in another country. Another 5, roughly, were hospitalised in some serious way that came to the attention of the Australian Consular Service. About 3 were arrested every 24 hours in that year, somewhere else, somewhere outside Australia. And somebody has to be there to kind of respond to all that and manage all of that. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward. In other cases, it's not. Now, that same part of any modern foreign service is also the element that steps forward to help manage a major crisis when it comes along. And during my own time running the consular service, what we're talking here about the period 2000 to 2005, I happened to be there for what is still probably Australia's biggest and worst consular tragedy, the 2002 Bali bombings, which affected many nations, but it affected Australia disproportionately, given the target sites were nightclubs in Bali, which were frequented largely by Australians. So in those 2 blasts back in October 2002 in Bali, 88 Australians were killed out of 202 people in total. About 38 Indonesians were killed. And then, of course, people of many other nationalities, including Americans, died tragically in the circumstances. So, I led the response to all of that. Anyway, why the book? Having painted that picture, I thought that it was worthwhile writing a bit of an insider account of what this work really looks like. The book is not a diplomatic memoir. I have actually been heard to say in previous times that I think there's a special place in hell for people who write diplomatic memoirs along the lines of, I did this, I did that. I don't see the point. But what I did see value in was writing an account of what the men and women of the Australian Consular Service do on a daily basis in support of their fellow nationals overseas, because some of the stories are truly heroic. And I am confident that the stories I've told about the Australian service could be reproduced very easily for many other nations. I know that to be true because I've had a lot to do with counterparts from other countries. So that was the motivation, to tell their story through my own voice.
Well, that's phenomenal. And Ian, as you said, it breaks a well through as we're talking about this larger cohort of people who served under you, with you, as compared to just your story. But these 2 events that you touch on, seminal moments in understanding national security, 9/11 in 2001 and shortly after the Bali bombings, that brought to the forefront in the global imagination, Islamic jihadism, terrorism. No country was now isolated, because back in the day there was this global north version of, if anything that happened in terrorism happened in the dystopian global south. But the fact that 9/11 destroyed the edifice of the national security apparatus of the most powerful country that we know, the United States, and Bali bombing affected Australia more closely. You said, how did the Australian foreign policy and the realpolitik, how did that just change, given that now no place was immune?
September 11 was such a watershed, and I think even now we're only understanding really clearly how much it impacted the world in so many ways, and how much it impacted our mindset. Now, of course, September 11 was ultimately and at core a tragedy in the United States. And for other countries, the impact was at a different level and a different scale, but it was a global event with global implications. It changed our understanding of where the threats lie. And in my book, I seek, the backing music, if you like, to this story about the consular service is exactly what you're talking about, the way global events shaped the context and spurred reform within the service. So September 11 for Australia was a significant event in many different ways. We in Australia invoked the ANZUS alliance with the United States, a long-standing alliance that goes back to the days after the Second World War. We found ourselves alongside the United States in the response in Afghanistan shortly afterwards. Indeed, the Australian SAS were among the first to cross the borders into Afghanistan in November 2001. Of course, we had the Iraq affair afterwards and the war on terror. Now, we look back with some questions in our minds on how we all managed that situation. But I think, as we look back with the benefit of hindsight, we also need to have some sympathy for the very human drivers that there were behind the policy responses. But in the terms that I'm talking about, the work of a government to protect, if you like, and support its citizens abroad, September 11 was a significant shock. Now, ultimately, on the day itself, I'll say only in air quotes, only 10 Australians were killed that day, and that's dwarfed, of course, by the number of Americans who were killed and other nationalities. Nonetheless, it was a very significant crisis in our country when Australians woke up to the event. So I was running the service at the time. We had an advantage in one sense, in that most Australians had gone to sleep by the time at the time those attacks took place, because it was late at night. It was about 10:30 roughly for most Australians, 10:30 at night. And so in the days before the mobile phone was really, really prevalent, the only way you knew that something had happened was if someone rang you up, or if somebody on your landline at home, or if you happened to be watching television or had the radio on. And so most Australians slept through the night. We knew that night that given the number of Australians living in Manhattan, and there were thousands, that we would be hit with a serious wave of anxiety through the Australian public the following morning when the news broke. So we had to prepare ourselves for a massive influx of phone calls that came in from anxious family members, loved ones. And we took 15,000 phone calls in the first 2 hours from Australians. And for us, the crisis was actually sort of dealing with that, coming to grips with, which cases were serious, which were not, and slowly but surely identifying who we really needed to be concerned about. And of course, our missions in Washington and New York were working desperately with US first responders to try and identify what was going on. Now, that story must have been reproduced, I know it was, again and again and again with many different countries. So my account is just to focus in on that. But it was, as you were suggesting, a moment when it slapped us in the face. On reflection, we should have seen it coming better than we did. But, of course, the intelligence agencies were aware of Al-Qaeda. They had been aware of Al-Qaeda since certainly as at least as late as the bombings of the US embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. But the true capacity, the awesome capacity of the global jihadist movement was not clear to anybody until that moment. And it's, in terms of our consular service, it drove us to build our capacity. We realized that we'd been overwhelmed. We were concerned about Al-Qaeda's franchise, if I can put it that way, in Southeast Asia, Jamaat Islamiyah. We had a sense of its capacity. And of course, only 13 months after September 11, Australia had its own version. That's when terrorism came close to home for us, and when Australia had to step forward. And we can talk about this to the extent that you're interested, but I think those Bali bombings were a moment when Australia came to a better understanding of itself in relation to its regional neighbourhood and its own capacities there.
You've kind of touched on what the bulk of the interview I want to be about, Australia's identity of itself, and I want to get into that. But just very quickly, I want to touch on events closer to home. Most recently, of course, Australia has a new Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. The Labor is back in power. It's been a minute since various Liberal leaders. What does it mean for Australia now? Because for a lot of people, of course, a lot of people are familiar with constitutional parliamentary democracy. So even under Labor, it was the Rudd and Gillard back and forth. And then, of course, you had a sway of leadership of Liberal Party with Prime Minister Abbott, Prime Minister Turnbull, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, now back to Labor. So what does it mean in Australia's now foreign policy psyche with the Labor? And are we going to see a conscientious shift, or is there a bipartisan agreement on Australia's foreign policy goals?
Look, broadly speaking, there are no huge radical changes in Australian foreign policy when a government changes, but there are some important differences. And you're right. So the what we call the Liberal National Coalition here in Australia had been in power for 9 years. The story's confused slightly because the personality of the individual Prime Minister changed a few times in that period. Let's not get into it. But it's, essentially, what we call the Liberal National Coalition were in power for 9 years. Actually, that's the Conservative side of politics, despite the name. It's a bit confusing, but let's think of them as the Conservatives. They lost power in this year, just a couple of months ago. And our other significant party, the Labor Party, came to power under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Look, there are some differences. First of all, in terms of Australia's relationship with the immediate region of the South Pacific, a region that is of some geostrategic significance, given the interest in which it's held by China and others, but which is also home to some very fragile economies and environments. The change of government offered the opportunity to do a bit of a reset there, because and the key reason for that is that the Labor government coming to power had a substantially different set of domestic policies on climate change to its Conservative predecessors. Now, in the Pacific, we, and I think the United States and others, are sometimes guilty of talking too much about the Pacific, almost as if it's some kind of vacant lot in which we duke it out with the Chinese, rather than reflecting on the fact that it is home to, rich cultures, populations, people with an interest in self-determination, and people to whom certain things matter. And so when we talk about things like, the AUKUS agreement and nuclear submarines and strengthening our collaboration in the Quadrilateral Alliance vis-a-vis China, that's all well and good, but many Pacific Islanders will say, and did say at the time of the AUKUS announcement, look, this is all very well, but if you can afford all this, you can afford all these submarines, then maybe you should be thinking about doing something about climate change. Anyway, the new government was able to come to power and send a very clear signal to the Pacific, namely, look, we take your concern seriously and we're going to try and do something about it. Important signal, and a signal that the previous government couldn't send. And look, the only other key difference or the other opportunity from a change of government is that our relationship with China had reached a really serious low point earlier this year over a range of issues. Australia was outspoken in calls for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19, offended the Chinese that way. We have barred Huawei from involvement in our telecommunications infrastructure. We have, in our typical way, we have called it as it is in this region, and things had reached a very serious sort of point of deterioration earlier this year. Now, the new government probably isn't all that different in its concerns about China's approach to the region, but the sheer change of personalities, the change of team, does nonetheless provide a chance for a reset.
Touching on China, of course, that, as I've discussed before on this podcast, the elephant in the room is always the dragon. And take you back to 2008, where there's a seminal moment in the world. Two things, of course: the financial collapse in the United States, which of course brought to light, or perhaps brought to debate, the idea of America as this preeminent pantheon of global superpowers. And of course, the Beijing Olympics, where China announced itself on the world stage. In that moment, Australia avoided a recession. And again, apropos of Donald Horne's lucky country story, and partly because of the commodity boom and the fact that China was building so much more and dependent on Australia. It was one of those reasons why the Quad never took off, given the fortuitous relation that Beijing and Canberra shared. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, shortly after, fluent Mandarin speaker, had very convivial relation with China. Australia's relation with China now have it another, as you rightly said, with questioning China's into the Wuhan virus, the Chinese government using its consulates in Australia to push back against pro-Hong Kong separatists. Where's Australia's relation with China now, given that in some sense it's still a very important, largest trading partner for domestic in Australia, and still important source of education, given a lot of Chinese students remain in Australian universities. But geopolitically, it's not happy days, is it?
No, it's, how can I put it, slightly less unhappy days than it was 2 months ago, but it's still fragile. That's how I describe it. Now, the Australian Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, actually has now had 2 meetings with her Chinese counterpart in the course of the last couple of months, the most recent in the margins of the UN General Assembly in New York only a week ago. And there is a sense that some positive momentum is building back into the relationship. I think that there needs to be a bit more stability in the relationship, and there needs to be some quite serious acknowledgement on both sides of the economic complementarity between China and Australia. Because these two economies are genuinely complementary. I'm sure Australia would have loved not to have imported Australian iron ore over the course of the last couple of years, but it had no option but to. There is a reliance on our primary resources, and of course we're very heavily exposed economically to China in many other sectors. So that economic relationship is important in both directions. But when you think about and talk about value systems, and you talk about natural strategic alliance, China does not loom large in the Australian thinking. And indeed, China's approach to the world over the course of the last several years has led to a very serious decline, according to all the polling, in terms of, Australians' public regard for China. The Lowy Institute here in Sydney does an annual poll of how Australians feel about foreign policy issues, and there has been a very substantial decline in the regard in which China is held here. A level of mistrust has emerged over the course of the last several years. That's not going to be fixed immediately, and I don't think we should think that China will ever be a like-minded strategic ally. It can be a good economic partner. The relationship can be much more sound, but we need to, I think, to be careful not to think of the relationship as more than that.
You're leading me down one of my favorite topics of soft power, and particularly something I like to talk about in the U.S. context of soft power vis-a-vis China. But I want to get into the mindset and the identity of Australia, because as someone who's been to Australia, and I consider myself an Australia tragic, and have an outsider looking in, obviously one of my favorite books in Australia has been Donald Horne's Lucky Country, and it was so seminal because it was written so much ahead of its time in 1964, if I'm not mistaken. And in that, of course, he eviscerates Australia, some very scathing remarks, and almost compares it to countries like Saudi Arabia. But what I want to take away from the book is he kind of speaks about a different time in the world, and an Australian time, which Australia being the lucky country, given like the United States, while there's never a comparison with the US, there's always a comparison of its erstwhile colonial masters in the United Kingdom, given it was its origin of the British period colony. But like the United States, was geographically isolated, perhaps more so than the United States. It had coastal shores, had good weather. But he speaks about a time of Australian insularity, whereas the US, fell far ahead of more in population, pushed and innovated. And he speaks about how Australia had a laid-back approach. I feel this book, for me, as someone who's very curious to understand Australia, I had to start with this book to really understand Australia. As someone who is Australian, has seen Australian foreign policy, crafted it, and been responsible for Australian statecraft, how would you define Australia's cultural paradigm vis-a-vis the thinking in the foreign policy? Does a lot of the cultural outlook obviously define Australia's foreign policy?
Yeah, I think it does, and I think that's why it's changed since Donald Horne wrote his book. It's interesting you've read that book. It was a very important book of its time, but let's put it in its time. Until the sort of 1950s, 1960s, Australia still had an exclusionary immigration policy. Most Australians, in addition to the Indigenous population, which we might come back to, were of largely British, but certainly European stock until certainly the Second World War. And indeed, there was no such thing as an Australian citizen. There was no Australian Citizenship Act until the second half of the 20th century, which sometimes astounds most Australians. We were all British subjects here, right? And, our cuisine and our culture was probably a bit monochromatic. Horne in his book, when he talks about the lucky country, he didn't mean anything very positive when he referred to us as the lucky country. I mean, the inference was very much that we were getting away with something, that we had managed so far largely through the luck of abundance of resources and so on, and that we needed to think much more cleverly about ourselves. And again, we were this, you could almost think of us as a European outpost on the other side of the world, or at least a British outpost on the other side of the world. That is being utterly turned on its head in the course of the last 50 years. The Australian migration story, beginning in the late 40s and then accelerating through the 60s and 70s and subsequently has been an extraordinary one. It's been fundamentally sort of revolutionary in the way we think about ourselves, the way we define ourselves. Thinking here about the ethnic and make up the various sort of heritages that Australians look back to now. So we had first, the immediate post-war era saw many displaced people coming from southern and Eastern Europe to this country. We had Greeks and Italians arrive. We had a significant Lebanese inflow through the 1970s following the conflict there. We then had the extraordinary Vietnamese sort of outflow into Australia through the 1970s, and subsequently it's been the Horn of Africa, it's been South Asia in particular, and India in particular in recent years. Australia is unrecognisable compared to the days of Donald Horn, I think. And yes, of course, that has affected our foreign policy outlook. There's been a much greater recognition that we are an independent actor, and that we, and that we're not none of us think of ourselves as an offshoot in any way of the United Kingdom anymore. Notwithstanding our constitutional arrangements, we still have the Queen as our head of state. We're an independent actor, and we recognise where we live in the world. So we talk about big architectural achievements in international diplomacy. The APEC structure, Australia invented that. That was the invention of Bob Hawke and when he was Prime Minister, and Paul Keating as a strategic force at the time in the 1990s. This was Australia seeking to shape international architecture to embrace the region that was important to it, bringing together natural long-standing allies such as the United States on one hand, with the countries of Southeast Asia and North Asia, which are obviously part of our neighbourhood and fundamentally important to us. So we very much have an Asia-Pacific-centric approach to foreign policy, and that's as it should be. I can't express just how different we are to the 1960s.
The evidence is telling in a lot of ways. And before I get to that, there's the particular question that comes to mind is the reason why the similarity with the United States that I drew upon is, apart from the examples I mentioned, is this during your book launch as well, there was the talk of paying a homage to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and like the United States, which has had a little bit of a turbulent past with Indigenous population, and Manifest Destiny Australia, of course, has had some of the similar issues in a different sense. But like the United States as well, there's been sort of a course correction, sort of acknowledgement. You spoke about some of the immigration thing, and I remember this clearly because one of my favorite museums in Australia has been the Immigration Museum in Melbourne, which is not talked about, but it gives you the insight into the Bring Out of Britain campaign and then the Eastern European migration in Greeks and Italians to finally. But do you feel that Australia somehow needs to have a sort of reconciliation with some of the past? Like New Zealand has the first part of its anthem all in Maori and then in English. For the first time in a long time, I think, at a Wallabies game, there was part of the anthem, Advanced Australia Fair, sung in era. Do you feel that Australia somehow, to really progress and achieve full potential, has to sort of reconcile with a little bit of a troubled past?
No, absolutely. And I wouldn't minimise our troubled past in this sense at all. I think that most thinking Australians will acknowledge very openly that we have some serious unfinished business to do in terms of reconciliation with the Indigenous people of this land. And it's a funny thing. Australians often describe themselves, and we're often described, particularly by European countries, as a young nation, as a new nation. And, people who think of us like that, and as I say, we're guilty of it ourselves, tend to take a certain definition to our history. And, it's a definition that has Australian history beginning in 1788 when the British settled in Sydney.
Yeah.
But of course, Australia is home to, and there's no argument about this, the oldest continuous living culture on the planet. Our Aboriginal people, 60,000 years of continuous habitation and custodianship of the land. And that's something to recognise and respect. And are we doing a good job at it? It's improving. The symbolism is certainly improving. I was last year at the Rugby League National Grand Final was held here in Brisbane. This is, our sort of biggest premier football event. Huge following across Australia, and a guy called Jonathan Thurston, who happened, was a well-known rugby league player here in Australia from northern Queensland, and is Indigenous himself, got up and gave the welcome to country at the beginning of the match in his own language. And the crowd of rugby league supporters were present, screamed their support for him. The reaction was unbelievably positive, and it was clearly heartfelt. And I thought to myself, my goodness, how far have we come? Because Australians, even though 10 years ago, had a bit of an awkward relationship with this whole question of acknowledgement of country and recognition. But really, in this country, if you begin a formal meeting of any certain size without acknowledging the local custodians of the land on which you're meeting, it's regarded as pretty rude. It's exception rather than the rule, and that's important. Look, underlying all that symbolism is a significant gap in terms of social standards and educational attainment, and the proportion of our peoples in prison and all these sorts of things. And that needs some very serious work. Symbolism is not the only thing, but it's an important thing.
Absolutely. It's something more important than just superficiality, as you rightly said. Another person who was very excoriating, like Donald Horne, was Lee Kuan Yew, our former Prime Minister of Singapore and the founding father of that. I lived in Singapore for many years, and I remember the story. Of course, I think Paul Keating was Prime Minister then, but I'd come to Australia in 2015 for the Cricket World Cup, and I remember there was a comparison of Australia in 92, the Hawke-Keating era, and what it was in 2015, and Bob Hawke being a cricket tragic, Paul Keating being none of those. And Paul Keating internalized Lee Kuan Yew's words, what he had said in those words, and about Australia not opening up, about its insularity. Would you say that was sort of the seminal point, the last 30 years where Australia, you said, looks unrecognizable as immigrants? But in terms of its foreign policy, that changing its outlook and no longer just being a British outpost, no longer being a European outpost in the East, but really being an Asia-Pac country, because for too long, Australia is part of Asia Pacific, not part of Asia Pacific. Depends on who you spoke to, depends on the CEO and the company's budget.
Yeah, that's right.
Now.
No, good old Lee Kuan Yew. I had the privilege of meeting him twice when I was working with Prime Minister Howard, and he was actually a great friend of Australia, but he was also very colourful in his language and very frank in his description. At one point, I think I've got it right. I think he referred to Australians as the white trash of Asia at one point. In a perhaps in a heated moment, but in any case, it's interesting to talk about this because it's a platform to talk about how much has changed over this time. The Hawke-Keating era of the the sort of late 80s and first half of the 90s were indeed an important period of change. It was a period where you had a government that was both reforming and stable, which were important ingredients, and which had a very clear sense of vision for Australia's relations with the region. And Hawke, who was Prime Minister, and Keating, who was Treasurer through that period, through most of that period, replaced Hawke as Prime Minister. Keating was, probably the arch strategist throughout it all. Still speaks on these issues and is still a bit of a thought leader and has an influence over our current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. But yeah, this was the time when APEC was born. This was the time when Australia reached out, particularly in its relationships to its immediate neighbours, its closest neighbours like Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and beyond. It wasn't when it started. I think I would go back a little bit further in time to the, in many ways, quite radical government of Gough Whitlam in the early 70s. The first time Labor had come to power since the Second World War. I mean, we'd had this extraordinary period of conservative rule under one Prime Minister right through the 1950s and 60s. Labor comes to power at a moment of public impatience for change. It's 1972, the women's liberation movement, decolonisation, all of this stuff is in the air. And Whitlam, like Nixon, went to China and was very quick to recognise Beijing. There was in Australia, we too had been involved in the Vietnam War. It had its own context. I think for the United States, it was probably more a broader geostrategic consideration about, how best to deal with Moscow, how to manage the relationship with China. In the Australian case, it was more about recognition of the region that we inhabited. And a reorientation of foreign policy. So I think that was really important back then in the early 70s. Consolidation in the 80s and 90s. And look, a clear bipartisan consensus on the importance of the region, the Asia-Pacific region, has continued for the last at least 30 years. One of our more conservative prime ministers, a bit short-lived, Tony Abbott, was the guy whose motto was more Jakarta, less Geneva. His way of saying we need to focus more on our key bilateral relationships in the region.
Speaking of the region, of course, one of the most important parts of Australian foreign policy in the last few years has been the quadrilateral dialogue, or the Quad as it's known, or Indo-Pacific Quad. Given its origin in 2004 as tsunami, really something that you and your time in foreign policy were aware of turbulence in the region, to when it kind of hit a bit of a pause when Australia was not so keen to be part of something that looked like an anti-China coalition, to now, in the last few years, being very, very vocal and very, very part of it. On one hand, I guess the common adversary in China, given India has that issue with China on the borders, Japan, China, but Senkaku, Dayu disputes, as well as historic US and China. We could be all night long if we discuss that. But of course, Australia's recent issues. Do you feel, one, it's more of engagement with the region, but also taming the Chinese dragon? Is that sort of where Australia's foreign policy lies right now with reference to the Quad?
Yes, it is. I think there's a very strong commitment that you see in the Quad for the significant democracies of this region to work together across a whole range of fields. But clearly there's a strong impetus for collaboration given the concerns that each of these nations, to differing extents, have about the influence and role of China in the region. Now, I spent a bit of time looking at China's role in the South Pacific, these small, fragile countries that we were talking about before. And much is made in that context of, the potential for China to exert influence with one of these countries to a point where they're able to establish a naval base and, disrupt some, fundamental defence alliances that exist across the Pacific. Yes, that's something to be concerned about, but I'm probably more concerned about the impact on value systems in some of these countries. We've seen some troubling trends in relation to media freedom in some of the countries where China exerts considerable influence or growing influence in the Pacific. So I do see a competition between value systems that is underway, and I think that's a way of thinking about the Quad. You're right. I remember it coming together in the wake of the tsunami. I was with the Prime Minister at the time. I was on the ground in Banda Aceh in Sumatra, the place that was hardest hit by the Boxing Day tsunami, within only a week or so of the tragedy, and I saw a very substantial surge in the relationship between Australia and Indonesia at the time, where not only the Australian government but the Australian public in general sort of reached out with donations and support and sympathy to our neighbours. It was a terrible tragedy, but in some ways it was a high point in our relations with the region. And of course, this cooperation began to develop with some of our like-mindeds. But and yes, there was a cooling of interest on Australia's part in the Quad for a period there, but that time's well behind us. I think Australian security and foreign policy has the Quadrilateral Alliance, near the centre of its approach.
I suppose the other book that really, apart from Lucky Country, that really fascinates me the most is Tyranny of Distance, given Australia, we alluded to some of it, Australia's distance and its British outpost to distant European outlook. Given the Tyranny of Distance has shaped Australia's cultural outlook policy, what would you say is, given the fact that neighborhood is such an important foreign policy, and I'd be remiss if I didn't come up to neighborhood, and you've served in Papua New Guinea, one of Australia's closest neighbors. I've always thought about, I want to ask you about Australia's foreign policy with neighbors, particularly with New Zealand as well as Papua New Guinea, given the Trans-Tasman relationship for me looks a bit like US and Canada. Very convivial, very brotherly-like, and the way the Canadians have bragging rights over the Americans in ice hockey, the Kiwis have it, or the All Blacks have it over the Wallabies in rugby. So is that some of a fair comparison?
Yeah. Look, well, first of all, it hurts me to say it, but you're right about the New Zealand All Blacks. In fact, they've got the leading edge over any other nation in the world in rugby. But look, as the interesting thing is, if you ask Australians which country is closest to us, most of them will give you the wrong answer. Many will say New Zealand. Some will say Indonesia. Very few of them get it right. The answer is actually Papua New Guinea, a country that isn't talked about much, including on the broader international stage. It's not a very small Pacific country, some little atoll. It's a country of 9-10 million people, and it lies literally 3.6 kilometres from the nearest Australian post office, situated on the island of Sabah in the Torres Strait that lies between the two countries. We think quickly about New Zealand because culturally it's quite similar to us, but we sometimes forget where the real neighbourhood is. We actually have very substantial relationships with all these countries, and government to government, the relationship with Papua New Guinea is very significant indeed. I served as Australian ambassador to Germany, and then I served as Australian High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea. And people who didn't know the Australian system and who saw me make that transition sometimes wondered, I think, what I had done wrong or who I had displeased to move from Berlin to Port Moresby. But the deeper truth, as anybody in the Australian Foreign Service will tell you, is that the position of Australian High Commissioner in Papua New Guinea is pretty much the biggest and best job we've got. Maybe not. Maybe Washington pips it, but and Jakarta might compete with it. But Papua New Guinea is, put it this way, I had 300 staff in Port Moresby. I had 80 in Berlin. I had a bilateral development program of 600 million Australian dollars in Papua New Guinea. I had the Australian Defence Force at my disposal because we have a very significant strategic development relationship with what is our neighbour. And one of my little bugbears is that I would love to see that very substantial government-to-government relationship reflected better in public understanding. Because the paradox of Australia's relationship with PNG is that all of that exists. There are many thousands of Australians like me. I happen to grow up in Papua New Guinea, who have a substantial link with the place, and yet there are many other Australians who might struggle to find it on a map, and who would struggle to tell you what the capital of the country is. It's a bit of a blind spot for us, and I'd like to see greater public awareness and greater public knowledge. This is an area where foreign policy and government approaches are out ahead of public awareness. Indonesia is better understood, better known, a much more substantial country, of course. It's an enormous country, one of the world's largest countries in population terms. And it looms large in different ways. Sometimes the relationship is a bit fraught. We have had some very serious consular cases, and I write about them in my book, which have led to the execution of Australian nationals in Indonesia on drugs charges. We have the Bali bombing, of course, was a moment which was a tragic moment for both our nations. It actually spurred some very serious, good collaboration. But the story, I guess what I'm saying, the story is not always a pretty one. And the economic relationship is a bit underdone. The New Zealand case is different. There is a natural affinity. We tend to understand each other. I think the comparison with the US-Canada relationship is not a bad one, because I think they're similar it's a similar story. The cultures are actually quite similar. The languages are almost the same, and yet the sensibility is a bit different. Although I think we're more like the New Zealanders than Americans are like the Canadians. I think there's a slightly bigger gap in that case. But of course, as the smaller party, New Zealand likes to find opportunities to best us, and they believe, sometimes rightly, that they have better credentials than we do in the South Pacific. I think it's particularly true in Polynesia, and the truth is that New Zealand can legitimately think about itself as a Pacific nation because it's surrounded by the South Pacific Ocean. It's a Pacific Island nation. We have an enormous, thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of coastline on the Pacific, but we're also an Indian Ocean nation, and we're also a nation that abuts Southeast Asia. So we're a bit more complex, and we're much bigger. And those change all sorts of things, including our strategic outlook. We are probably some New Zealanders would object to me saying this, but I think we are a much closer adherent to the US alliance than New Zealand is.
I suppose one part of the Trans-Tasman comparison I left out was US, like Canada, the more boisterous, louder neighbor and foreign policy. Australia, like similar to New Zealand, is more pronounced. Whereas New Zealand and Canada have the good boy vibe going for them.
Yeah, that's the New Zealand narrative, not the Australian narrative.
That's fair. I suppose right now with Her Majesty's passing, Australia, like Canada and New Zealand, of course, remains very much Commonwealth, and with the Queen remains head of state. There's been a clarion call for republicanism within parties as well. Given we spoke about Gough Whitlam, but Menzies, of course, is one of the most biggest Anglophones, and I think he was in charge when Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth ascended to the throne. Do you see this now taking more shape now that the new monarch is in town, a new monarch on the throne, and perhaps maybe your own personal identity and understanding Australia right now? Do you think for Australia to start off a new chapter and embrace anything, still be part of the Commonwealth but also Republic?
Yeah, this is another area where we've come a long way. You refer to dear old Robert Menzies, our Prime Minister through the 1950s and 60s, who famously said during, and I think to the Queen's embarrassment, he said at a public event during her visit, she did. I didn't but see her riding by, and yet I'll love her till I die. This was the sentiment of a real monarchist in Australia. No Australia would dream of speaking like that these days. Look, I think it's a bit like many other countries. The regard in which Queen Elizabeth II was held sustained the reputation of the monarchy in this country. And Republicans certainly are seeing this as a time of opportunity. There's been a bit of restraint because generally speaking, even the Republicans have felt they needed to respect the period of mourning. But the gloves are coming off now, and the Republican movement here is making a march. Now, this is an interesting thing, right? We actually had a go at this back in the 1990s. We had a referendum first launched by Paul Keating when he was Prime Minister. By the time the referendum happened, he'd lost an election and John Howard was Prime Minister, a monarchist. But we had a referendum. We had a genuine plebiscite on whether we should become a republic. And look, even then, I think most Australians thought, well, yeah, of course we should have an Australian head of state, rather than this slightly obscure and slightly theoretical relationship with the Crown. And yet the referendum did not pass. And mainly because the Republican movement hadn't done enough work on what the alternative system would be. We look at alternative systems. We, generally speaking, quite like the Westminster system. In other words, a system where the head of executive power is actually the person who controls Parliament. So the Prime Minister is actually the leader of the bloc that leads Parliament, rather than someone who is elected directly by the people. We look at the American system, and we're not sure we like that. We don't really like the idea of putting so much executive power in the hands of one figure, even with all the balance of power arrangements you have in the US system. We don't really like that. So what does the alternative look like? Do you just do away with the relationship with the Queen, take the person we now call the Governor-General, who just is the representative of the Queen, and call that person a president and be done with it, and appoint that person in the same way that we appoint the Governor-General, which is basically the Prime Minister chooses them? Or do you directly elect the Australian head of state? And if you're going to do that, doesn't that involve changing the system quite drastically? So these are the issues. But look, right now, and our Prime Minister has said this, there is a bigger priority, a bigger constitutional priority, and that is to enshrine an Indigenous voice, as we call it, in the Australian Constitution. This is a proposal that has come from Aboriginal leaders in Australia, which would enshrine an advisory mechanism within the Australian Constitution, a voice to Parliament is what it's called, for Indigenous people to provide input into Australian law. The current government has vowed that it will seek to achieve this. This will go to referendum here in Australia in the course of the plan is in the course of this current term, so in the next 3 years at some point. And to be honest, we just don't have the bandwidth to do that and the Republic in the next couple of years. So I think the Republic could come next term if Labor's in power. Labor probably will be in power unless they do something pretty bad to stuff it up. I suspect they'll get 2 terms. So I think we might get a referendum on the Republic within the next several years. But there'll be debate again, and we need to be really clear about what we're replacing the current system with. That's the conundrum. That's why it failed in 1999.
Well, you can see America is far from utopic in its systems, rather from the Supreme Court intervention to a president alleging that the election was stolen. But Ian, you've been very generous with your time, and I think the last one to tee it up for you to maybe give you a Trevor Chappell underarm that you can actually hit for a 6 this time, is soft power, something I'm a big fan of. Joe Nye codified the term, and I suppose it's America's preeminence in the world, which is economic, military might, also been in soft power. I mean, Hollywood, MTV, McDonald's telling you more. And in some ways, the new Bond movie also showed a relation where Britain had lost its soft power, because when James Bond first appeared on screen in 1963, Britain was still a very preeminent. The empire was still around in some ways. Perhaps decolonization started. As someone who grew up far from Australia, but also saw it, and I saw Neighbours, Home and Away, of course, is cricket. And given Australia has soft power in terms of its sporting excellence and pedigree and Aussie-old football, where do you think Australia stands culturally now in the imagination of the global community, or where does Australia like to see itself? And perhaps what are some of the lacunas that Australia can fix beyond just tourism and its sporting prowess?
I think there's a huge lag effect in cultural reputation for every country. We tend to, our ideas about, no matter what country you're talking about, ideas about the country concerned tend to be based a little bit more on what the country used to be like. And so even I think abroad, for many, the Australian reputation is still a little bit Crocodile Dundee. And look, there are aspects of the Crocodile Dundee character that laconic, irreverent, sort of slightly rough kind of approach. We actually quite like the larrikin approach. We kind of like that about ourselves. But this is another area where you can't underestimate how much we've changed over time, and I do think there is a bit of a lag effect. I think some things you're talking about, the very strong focus on sport, and it's just an openness in approach. These are things that are positives and are really very attractive. People are drawn by the Australian style, if I can put it that way. And I know that because I've represented Australia in many different places. I don't want to overdo it because we can't always assume this, but generally speaking, if you're in another country, whether it's the United States or, wherever it is, people respond pretty positively to you when they understand you're Australian. And that's based on something. That's based on a certain set of expectations about who we are. So I think while we're changing in all the ways we've been describing, we need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are some basic Australian characteristics. They're actually pretty good characteristics. I think about representing Australia in Germany. So, I was ambassador in Germany for 4 years. Unlike in Papua New Guinea, if you're the Australian ambassador in Germany, you're one of, 170 diplomatic heads of mission based in Berlin in the batting order. You're, it doesn't work to speak about it in cricketing terms, because I reckon you're about number 40 or 50 in the batting order in terms of importance on the local scene, well below many others. So you need to play your angles. You need to think creatively about how you get access to ministers, how you exert influence, how you drive your own agenda, no matter what your agenda is. And Australia's soft power reputation works for us. There is certainly in the German case, if you walk into some great diplomatic event and you've got that small kangaroo on your suit lapel, it's a little bit of a signal, and it kind of works a bit as a beacon. People generally know, because our diplomatic service has a pretty good reputation, that if you have a conversation with an Australian diplomat, it's going to be of substance. It's not going to be empty. You might learn something. The Australian counterpart's going to be prepared, going to be thoughtful in what she or he says. But also, I think there's a sense that you can relax a bit with the Aussie. You don't have to be too on your guard. And I think those things are useful for us. And whatever they are, whatever it is, we need to be careful in our anxiety to improve ourselves and, transform ourselves culturally. But we need to be careful not to abandon them.
And with that, we bring this episode to a close. If you like what you're hearing, kindly give us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell a friend. So until next time, on The Global Detail. This podcast has been a production of Karkata Media in association with Perspicacity Media LLC. All guest views are their own. If you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, email us at globaldetailpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at Global Detail Pod. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a review. Copyright 2022 by Karkata Media LLC. All rights reserved.